Introduce Cory France. Cory is a public historian, folklorist, and artist with a passion for preserving and amplifying underrepresented narratives. A graduate of Howard University and American University, he is a currently completed dual master's degrees in historic preservation and cultural sustainability, it's a tongue twister, Cory, at Goucher College last year. Cory brings a multifaceted background in cultural sustainability, historic preservation, and strategic communications. He has led work at the intersection of storytelling, research, deep facilitation, and advocacy, forging sustainable cultural partnerships that empower communities and drive the preservation of marginalized heritage sites. Most recently, and that's what Cory's going to be talking about tonight, he's been documenting the historic Palmetto Cemetery in Columbia, South Carolina, leading efforts that secured a state historical marker and a determination of eligibility for the National Register of Historic Places. As an active steward of the cemetery, he is engaged in long-term preservation planning and community-based stewardship. Cory also serves as a board member of the Wagoja Foundation and serves as a member of the Rich Land Historic Preservation Consortia, where he works to strengthen public engagement in the preservation of African American history and heritage across South Carolina. So everybody please welcome Cory to the podium.
This is weird to do, like facing the screen and not y'all. But hello everybody, I'm Cory France. As James said, I work for New South Associates as an architectural historian, but I also work really on a volunteer basis outside of that work to protect Black spaces, Black historic sites. And some of those include cemeteries, which is what we're talking about here today. So the talk that I'm doing tonight is called Scenes at the Stakes, Black Cemetery Citizenship and Grave Matters at Palmetto Cemetery. It comes out of several years of research, documentation, and descendant interviews, and my own growing relationship with the cemetery, to Palmetto Cemetery, that people have passed, for years without really seeing it. It is a talk about burial grounds, but it's also a talk about time, about memory, about land loss, kinship, and what it means to care for Black places under conditions that were never designed to keep them whole. I want to begin here with a Harriet Tubman quote. Some said this is her last words. I go to prepare a place for you. In this backdrop is the site of what we understand as a family to be family land, where some of my ancestors are buried, but it's actually owned by SCNG or Dominion Energy at the moment. But I mean, you'll hear a little bit more about that in a second. But those words to me were more than just sentimental. They were really practical words. I think they assume continuity. It assumes a future for descendants. And I assume when those words were spoken, it was for all Black people who Harriet Tubman has literally given her life and risked her life trying to save during some of the most tragic times for Black people in this nation. They assumed that preparation itself could actually be a form of care, a process of care. And so that line stayed with me, and that this project in so many ways is really about preparation. It's about preparing a place, it's about preparing memory, it's about preparing language, and preparing the ground so that people are not buried twice. I'll find out more about what that means. And I guess this, I come to this work with a bit of a fracture, as I like to call it, through record. On my mother's side, one lineage can be traced through ships, documents, and European records. That includes Jacob Gustav Hofer, who you probably can't see that much on this screen, but he's in the top right This white guy here that has the long frosty beard, it kind of reminds me of Santa Claus a little bit. He's a Russian immigrant who later crossed the color line in South Carolina when it was very dangerous to do so, and built a life with Sally Brown, who was not pictured. It's one of those fractures. My great-great-great-grandmother, probably a few great-grandmothers. And she was a formerly enslaved woman whose lineage really remains far less recoverable than many of his records. Their union to me just left me with both a traceable past and sort of a wound in the archive because I can't really fully know her story. On the other side of my family, my mother, my mother's father was actually adopted at birth, and he died with really only fragments about his biological family. So on that side, there are really no more paths to follow, no graves to visit, no names that I can really confidently call on. So for me, burial grounds have never really just been about the dead. It's really been, they hold parts of us that were never really written down. They hold relation where the record fails, and they hold continuity where the paper starts to thin out when you're going through archival research. And so that is why the words that was on the previous slide, and the words preparation, continuity, and return means so much to me in this project. And here there's a record of in the local paper. I can't remember what the newspaper article was specifically because it's probably changed by then, but you see here that Gustav was involved in a court case, and he was asked to speak to something that he witnessed, but no one actually wanted to believe what he said because he only dealt with Black people, and he was known for loving this Black woman like pretty overly and having family. Having a bunch of children actually with her. And so you see a little bit of that. You also see in his will and testament how he speaks about Sally. Now this is also one of those things that kind of is challenging for me to really review, as a descendant of this lineage, because I'm like, look at the color. I mean, we're looking at the racial power dynamics at that time, and it makes me wonder if what he's documenting, the love that what I'm receiving as care on the page, is actually something else, and just, and maybe Sally is somewhat buried in this and sort of trapped in this narrative as like things were all great during this time when in fact they weren't. He's a watchmaker at the time. He's pretty much rubbing elbows with all of the folks that, had power and were pretty aligned with power, being, a white Prussian immigrant who is good with silver and understands, orology. So that, I put this on the slide because I like to just bring into focus what I've been discovering in my own journey, sort of those fractures, how they show up and how to interpret that. And on the right here is Zellhofer, who is Gustav's grandson. As you can see, he's a pretty chocolate man, so it's proof that they definitely had a connection. I want to let this poem kind of do some of the work for me, just like sort of really grounding what this really is. And I call it Rich Land. Of course, it was really inspired by Rich Land Historic Preservation Consortia, which was founded by a dear elder of mine who I consider a griot. I call her Mama Griot because she knows everything about Black Columbia. And I even think she even knows more probably about her parents' lives and their stories than they did. But I wrote this just to kind of capture sort of what my experience is like and how I look at this topic. And it goes, I come from rich land that remembers the names the state forgot, from hands that kept planting what the deed could not, from fence lines turned to liquid prayers, from keepers who stayed when no one cared. I was born from ground that was never meant to keep me, from a country that calls our dying easy, that builds its peace on somebody's loss, still keeps our bodies, that's the cost. I learned early that land holds ghosts and proof that the same dirt that buries us can lift the truth. Sometimes our dreams, the only deed we've got left, and still we sign it with our last breath. So this ain't a presentation, it's resurrection, a return to ground that raised me, to the place that's still teaching me how to listen, how to answer back without permission. Because when the dirt speaks, I answer, rising through what remains, carrying proof in my palms, even the grave knows my name. And this is Big Daddy, what we call him. That's my great-great-grandfather. You saw him on the previous slide. He's sitting outside of his store on Hayward Brockington Road. Most of my family lives there. To this day, the Crane Creek community is kind of literally off the records. And this is a picture of me at the big house. And this is like right across the street from where you're seeing Big Daddy. So I just like to show that difference, to show the legacy and the lineage that I come from. Rashida Phillips, this queen here, helped me understand a lot. This project honestly couldn't have been organized without a lot of her ideas, because it's really not a neat project. Nothing dealing with burial grounds is really neat. I mean, we're really getting dirty, and we're talking about, you know, property lines and boundaries and all of these things that we're considering. But she really helped me really decolonize my relationship with time. And her work in Black Quantum Futurism, she writes in this book, Dismantling the Master's Clock, she gives me language for understanding what I was already feeling at Palmetto Cemetery, that the timelines didn't really line up too cleanly, the records were kind of partial, the boundaries were shifting, the care was more cyclical and it wasn't really linear. And what revealed the truth of the place was not just this straightforward chronology, but fragments, returns, sort of moments and ruptures. And so I decided to follow this a little bit more with scenes. And so my returns to this site kind of become scenes. My interactions with it, the tendings that I've seen and I'm witnessing from other stewards, all of these have become sort of scenes. They're temporal sort of relationships. And in a way, you know, looking at this through a Black studies lens, I mean, it's reclaiming Black time. These are not dead spaces. These are spaces that are still alive and they hold records. So I really appreciated her teachings, and I strongly suggest reading her work. I mean, she's a genius and the epitome of what it's like to think about futurity when it comes to Black people. There's a study of hers that she writes a little bit about walking through a former slave dwelling and looking at archives, with the sort of artifacts that were in there, looking at them as sort of portals and looking at them as sort of time capsules. So if we start to look at bodies as that, the memory, the embodied memory, the feelings, the grief, the loss that's embedded in that landscape, they really are sort of portals, passages to sort of deeper truths. So this sort of weird, very, very, very weird, sort of Afrocentric, futuristic lens is really something that I found appealing as a Black futurist myself. So we're gonna really look at the history of Palmetto. I'll just give you a sort of broader strokes. There's a lot to go here, but this is sort of the most linear, sort of historic preservation-y narrative I can give you, to give you the nuts and bolts. But the Palmetto Cemetery was founded in 1920 by Willis Gregg Johnson, who was really a pioneer in African-American mortician and funeral home owner. He was the owner of Johnson's Funeral Home, which you see here at the bottom right here. It was one of the first, it was really a pillar in Columbia's Black community. A lot of descendants, a lot of my ancestors and other relatives were buried through Johnson's Funeral Home. It now continues today through Palmer Memorial Chapel, if any of you are familiar with that site. But it was created during Jim Crow. And this is a sign of, you know, sort of a Reconstruction era where Black folks are participating in society and finally understanding what citizenship can look like, actually getting education and opening up schools. And now we have, you know, businesses. Sad to say that, you know, the funeral home was like one of the few businesses, but it gave us relative, you know, autonomy. And so this was sort of the spirit that this cemetery was really developed from. the son of a Reconstruction era leader who's friends and best friends with the politicians of the times, their children. So he's pretty wealthy and well known. There's some images in the archive that show him actually shaking hands with Paul Robeson, and he had his slick back hair. Probably had hair products that I can't even get at this point, but he probably had better hair products at the time. I mean, there were just, he's representing sort of the black elite during this time. And it was really created, as a response to limited burial options that for families post Randolph Cemetery's era. And so obviously with Reconstruction, we want to erase everything that shows any sign of progress. And we want to separate black and white life. Those experiences should not mix at this time. So this is sort of the remnants of that, the result of that sort of way of thinking about society and being in relation with one another. It was originally measured at 25.7 acres. Now it spans 17.83. We think it's associated with a loss. Shout out to James, because he really helped me a lot with looking at maps and understanding, trying to piece together where this loss could have actually occurred. And it's linked to the suburban development that was happening in Northwood Hills and the construction of Alcorn Middle School, which is sort of on the borders. And so we trace this land back through a number of exchanges, but most prominently through David G. Ellison Sr., who had an insurance company at the time. So here again brings about one of those other sort of fractures and those sort of cracks to think about. Was the relationship between Johnson and Ellison, was it this cool, sort of mutually reciprocal relationship? Or was it the power dynamics, the racial dynamics during the time shaping what could have happened for him formally in terms of developing an actual site, doing that with intention and with a real plan? I doubt during the Jim Crow era that this was going to be celebrated for a black man being able to actually operate a burial ground of this scale. So it's one of those areas that I'm still kind of sitting with. And this is an area, a very poor area of what the site is, and it's not really, haven't been able to zoom in close enough to kind of show you the parcels of land that were divided up to form Northwood Hills. So that's the first section of that neighborhood, Steffendale Road. It's the first row of homes that are right there on those cemeteries boundaries. I'm sorry about that. And the cemetery is still sitting there. This is the 1955 area. You will see a noticeable jump in bodies, the amount of bodies that are happening during this period, 1951 to 1955. This could be a response to all of the hardship that was happening during that time. I mean, that impact on mortality was something to think about and something to look at. So there's another possibility that Ellison could have been selling cheaper, insurance to these families and able to capitalize off of the relationship with Johnson because he was already a prominent funeral home owner that was pretty well respected, aside from most of the black people during that time. It is home to a lot of Bobby Donaldson from the USC Center for Civil Rights. He always says this is the site of the who's who of Black Columbia, because it quite literally is. This is just a short list. A lot of firsts, licensed black female physician, a lot of mother of the civil rights movement in South Carolina. I think that's a pretty big flex. And Celia Dow Saxon, I mean, literally everything is named for her at this point. If you're black in Columbia, you're familiar with Celia Saxon. James Miles Hinton. I mean, these are just Nathaniel Frederick. So these are just a few of the names that are actually in this site. Not to mention all the other black folks that were participating in this movement whose lives were significant because they lived to actually be able to tell the story. So it's just the site of all sites, if I must say so myself, and certainly a continuation of the same spirit that we got from Randolph. Where we sort of end our chapter there, this is really sort of the descendant of Randolph Cemetery. So really, really important. I I've gotten connected to a group of elders, descendants, who are the first descendants of the folks that really started to organize and to really think through an infrastructure, be it informal, not really a formally planned cemetery. There was a sort of care team and a care model already sort of underway. And it started with this group of descendants. It started with 3 descendants, Fanny Phelps Adams, Myrtle Gordon, who's responsible for building a lot of Columbia's Black neighborhoods along with her husband, and E. Perry Palmer, and Harold White. I think a lot of folks are familiar with him as Coach White. He's a pretty prominent, well-known USC coach, and he's brought a lot of Black folks into their sort of first experience with athletics in white school systems, integrated school systems. But today, those descendants are Straywell Patterson, who is not pictured, but I always like to name them. Veronica Albritton Davis and Vanessa Briggs, who is also connected to the family that is associated with the Briggs versus Elliott case. She's married to Titus Briggs, and they're very proud of that story. It's actually one of the interviews that I have coming up to go a little bit deeper into their journey here in Columbia and their family history here in Columbia. But they sort of serve as the stewardship base. And so as I was moving through this and thinking about the cemetery as sort of just a preliminary documentation effort, just to get it on the record, I realized that there was another history that was really forming, and it was this care model, this cemetery care model that, albeit informal and sort of scrappy in terms of how it is done, it still has real meaning. And this is a sort of traditional practice that's connected to Black communities in dealing with the dead and dealing with afterlife. And so, yes, like I was saying before, it's really the place, the who's who of Black Columbians are buried here. This is their home. And this sort of tradition of caring for the site really sort of emerged in the late 70s, shortly after, some decade or so after Johnson has passed away, and his wife has sort of taken over sort of operations for the cemetery's burials. And as of late, I write this here, but we did receive a state historical marker thanks to Richland County Conservation Commission and the Department of Archives and History. And it would not have happened had it not been to the grassroots efforts and the documentation of this group. So I always like to name that. And of course, when I first learned of them, I saw them in the meeting. I always laugh at this photo because Mr. Patterson looks so serious this time, but he's the sweetest guy. And he feeds you really, really well. This is really good payment, right? And Miss Vanessa Briggs, who was the former president of this association, she was 2 years old when she started visiting Palmetto Cemetery and had not left. She's had survived breast cancer twice. And she's been an educator, teaching theater at Alcorn Middle School, right next door. Her mother, Myrtle Gordon, the founder of this association, one of the founders, brought her out to that cemetery, and she taught her how to care for these markers, these headstones, and taught her the practice of just tending to the dead with dignity and respect. And there were just a number of different media articles some years ago of them just making appeals to the community to come out and really help. To no success until I arrived. And here's just, I like to include these sort of documents from E. Perry Palmer, who was also a part of this lineage. I mean, he really sort of led that group through this sort of continuous tradition, through the Johnson Funeral Home tradition, which he has memorialized through his own funeral home shortly after Johnson's funeral home burned down in 1983. And then Coach White, of course, him and his wife Mozella, who is still alive and still very involved with this association. I like this note. I like to pull up this note a lot. This is like the first, my sort of field notes. I did this as a part of my process when documenting. I wanted to document how I felt and what my initial reactions were going to this site. And I write this note, and it says, these invisible borders are gateways to truth. And I'm thinking in the same note, same vein as Rashida Phillips. Like, this is a gateway, this is a potential portal to some other truths, some deeper truths about the site. And I say, interesting what we find at borders. There's no gate here, and the elders can't seem to recall that there ever was one. No fencing, no real formal entrance, just two brick pillars standing there like they never got finished. And the place imposes no boundaries. The land doesn't tell you when you stepped in it, but you know when you're at a burial ground. You gotta know, especially when it's large as this. Oh, I have this from a person in tree that I documented, and there's a poem that goes along with it, but for the sake of time, I won't. But this is just sort of, the poem that I wrote was capturing the beauty of this tree and just, you know, what it means and what it represents. There's life still happening in the place of the dead. I want to talk a little bit about no value. There's some photos missing here. Oh, there they go. Rashida Phillips is one of the great scholars that I've referenced, as I mentioned earlier before, but another one that I think really sort of embodies this lineage, this sort of Black fugitivity, Black freedom-seeking lineage, just sort of looking forward, thinking about continuity, is Andrea Roberts, and I think she's at the Center for Cultural Landscapes at UVA. But she started this project, the Texas Freedom Colonies Projects, to document freedom colonies, that the sort of the first communities, Black communities that were being developed in Texas. And that's sort of been developed over time into this major atlas that is looking to document similar communities where there's evidence of Black life. But she also proposes, in thinking about these sites, she talks about them as a planner. She talks about how planners and how most folks, there's these spatial imaginaries that exist. And one is the white spatial imaginary that really sort of looks at landscapes the way that privileged white folks would look at landscapes. So there's a lot that is gonna go missing in documentation if, you know, the folks that are in practice are typically white folks that are talking about these spaces. So she's like, as a curator, she's looking at how they're looking at valuing these landscapes, and she proposes something like called no value. And she's like, you know, they reduce the value of Black sites to nothing. And this is her way of sort of thinking about place and how do we fill in those voids? How do we add more value? How do we add value to places that are being devalued actively? And I just thought that was like really, really good intellectual grounding. I saw burial grounds like this, and especially these informal burial grounds, they really carry sort of a no value to other folks unless you're attached to the site. So I thank Andrea Roberts for that framework. When I was going through sort of my archival journey and just trying to develop a fuller context for Palmetto Cemetery, beyond the ones that I read, that I mean, we could pull from any boilerplate language, but I really wanted to actually sit in the archives and sort of allow the photos and the images that I was seeing connected to Black people to speak to me. What are they telling me? And so what I discovered is that, you know, I was experiencing sort of these hauntings. There was, you know, after every Black cultural landscape, whether it's a block or a certain building, it's being policed. There's police officers hanging out, and this is the Carver Theater stretches block on Hardin Street, which is really could be a commercial corridor, a Black commercial corridor. But I mean, it's really been just sitting there on Hardin Street all this time. It's no one's really interacting. And now there might be other logistics and things involved behind the scenes, but I mean, there's a lot of time that has passed since these places have been closed down. Why are they still sitting there sort of as dead spaces? Same here, these are photos and moments, sort of scenes and hauntings from the root doctor, the famous root doctor, Edward Harkless, who was actually murdered in Ridgewood, the Ridgewood community, within Eau Claire, the former township of Eau Claire. But Black folks typically know about his story, but all of the press around this story was more about the spooky dooky, oh my goodness, this is a root doctor, maybe, you know, maybe he's gonna cast a spell, like maybe this is gonna be bad luck, whatnot. But this was a whole life, you know, someone that was murdered. And at the time in Ridgewood, a majority, like 90% of the murder cases were from people that knew the murderer. And this is a predominantly Black space during that time in Black community. But again, a haunting. I'm seeing cop cars again. I'm having to think about death. And here's another example of a haunting. This is happening sort of off of Monticello Road, still in an Eau Claire neighborhood community, but residents of Friday's Alley. This is during a campaign to demolish homes. You know, were they probably lowly and probably needed a lot of repair? Perhaps, but they're still homes of Black folks. And with the demolition and the erasure of these types of communities, so go the stories, so go the memories and the histories. So we really don't have really a public identity that really expresses Black cultural life. The good, the bad, and the ugly. And so in taking that back and just thinking about what we were just talking about, I always return to Andrea Roberts' question, then how then does the curator become a willing accomplice of fugitivity, this sort of freedom seeking? That is, how does a public historian or the preservationist explicitly seek out and foreground attempts to seek freedom from socio-spatial constraints in racialized landscapes? I mean, it's a tongue twister, it really is. But I love what she's saying. It's like, how do we imagine this? And one of her biggest theories is, performance as place preservation. So she's following these sort of performances. In many ways, this sort of return to the cemetery, our acts of care, our acts of tending to the site and interacting with the site is really sort of it's sort of a performance if you're a Black person. So this is where that sort of idea of cemetery citizenship started to really get real for me. What does a Black cemetery citizenship actually look like? It is a performance in a way, a performance of acts of care. But this is not, of course, neglect alone. It is structure. All of it is a structural consequence. The reason for these sites really kind of were motivated by the structural activities that were happening as a result of policies and sort of racist thinking, segregated thinking. And so how do we memorialize an event that is still ongoing? Because it's still happening with burial grounds. I think many of us can agree. And this image in the back is Allen Benedict Court. Sean, I think, did like the last sort of documentation or something of the sort with this community. But again, public housing community, but a significant amount of Black life was actually present in the city. It's no longer there. And here goes an article from just, again, another haunting as we're going through this together. And so here's where I like to step into the wake, and this is where the stake starts to become clear. I'm really building upon this Black radical tradition, the thoughts of Black radical scholars, intellectuals, artists who were really thinking about place differently, relationships differently, looking at fugitivity. Where do we exist outside of this bubble where our heritage is being evaluated by folks that really don't quite understand everything that's associated and all the meaning that's embedded in these landscapes. So I'm really building upon this sort of lineage intellectually in my practice. And Fred Moten's had In the Break, Christina Sharp had In the Wake, and this is where my work is my intervention is at the stake, quite literally. And I would have to acknowledge Catherine McKittrick, who really sort of coins this Black geographies term. So it has us looking at Black place and Black spaces a lot different than we look at most other spaces. Within this concept that Christina Sharp lifts up, she talks about the weather, this concept of the weather. And I like to look at this as what we were just experiencing with the hauntings that Andrea Roberts really inspired through this null value look and just kind of looking at landscapes, where the opportunities, where the silences. Everything that we just experienced was the weather that is associated with a Black site like Palmetto Cemetery. And she says, the weather is the totality of our environments. The weather is total climate, and that climate is anti-Black. And in what I'm calling the weather, anti-Blackness is pervasive as climate. The weather necessitates changeability and improvisation. It is the atmospheric condition of time and place. It produces new ecologies. And I thought, well, what is the weather around Palmetto Cemetery? It's a Black site. This is pretty relevant because we're talking about anti-Black themes. Those contexts are really kind of shaping sort of the significance, the sort of context around this cemetery. So I really love this, and I thought, wow, this is so closely aligning. We just need some different kind of language to really understand how does that work practically for Black folks. And I say here, Palmetto is not stuck in the past, it is a wake site. It's a site where you go and you return and you wake up, and you also grieve. You return to those legacies of enslavement, you return to those patterns of anti-Blackness. You can't miss it. You can't miss it in your discoveries. And so, like I said, I was moving into this sort of idea, how do I continue upon that lineage of, there's the break, there's the wake, now I'm thinking it's the stake, that rhymes. And it kind of captures so many different meanings that I think characterize and, sort of explain the sort of experiences, the relationships, what is being put into this sort of practice of caring for these types of sites. As well as the site really being sort of a monument and a memorial itself. But one of the things that I think really captures, one of the scholars that really kind of captures this a lot, this sort of, I see the spirit of Zora Neale Hurston. Even how Zora Neale Hurston was rediscovered again, it was at, an unmarked burial. And so we wouldn't have had our work had someone not thought to let's explore that. Let's actually look and see, where the body is, and try to construct and revise this sort of erased part of history that was mostly just forgotten over time. But I love it because Zora represents a politics of refusal that I think, a Black radical tradition would need. Knowing what the limits are. Where do you draw the line in the sand? Where do you refuse to let these things slip away from your memory, even if they're a dead space that you got a lot of grief attached to, or maybe, the way you lost that loved one was just so tragic that you just can't return to it. Sometimes we do tend to forget about these sites too, because, they're asleep. We don't want to wake them up, right? But this refusal that Zora embodies, I think, is what I was starting to get from my own interactions with the cemetery. I don't want this site to not be documented and to be forgotten. And so, the stake really becomes like a language for us to continue that tradition and to think about it in practice. It names more than one thing at once. It's the claim, to memory, to ground, to relationship. It's a risk, because Black burial grounds do actually remain vulnerable to erasure. It's an investment, in care, and returning, and continuity. It's a boundary marker. I mean, isn't this kind of just strangely cool that I've been able to, I always laugh about it, but it just took this form, and it's a grave marker, and just, it's a reminder that, what is at risk when land, memory, kinship are treated as disposable, that null value. So I looked to doing stake work, and I was like, well, what does that look like? Because I know some historic preservationists are going to be like, what does that look like? What's the practical thing that goes into this? Well, it's really rooted in this sort of wake theory, right? So in a way, to do stake work, you kind of got to be dealing with anti-Blackness, perhaps. You got to be dealing with the consequences of anti-Blackness in these systems, because we're seeing the site as a wake. Again, it's through this lens of the legacies of enslavement and all of the policies and all of the, interactions and the engagements that shape that life for Black people. That isn't so great. So you need to kind of have an understanding of these geographies, Black geographies, and you need to understand the experiences of Black folks, the deeper contexts that are shaping Black folks in public life. But it's really about practicing field work as a kind of ritual. So this is the practice that we're really defining now. This is Black cemetery citizenship. Okay, we're staking. What does staking mean? Does it mean, it means site visits. It means the documentation that I'm talking about. But documentation and site visits and research with that lens, with the aha, sitting with the hauntings too. Not skipping over them, because it's easy to skip over those parts in the historical narrative, right? Because, it's not so easy to look back at those histories that are a little challenging. But there is so much hidden and embedded in those silences, and what is shared and what is not. And community engagement. I mean, can you really stake without the people that care most? Can you really do that without collaborating with them? And so this work looked like collaborating a lot with the families to center their embodied knowledge. What do you remember when you came back at 2 years old? You practically don't remember anything at 2 years old, but I remember Miss Briggs telling me, she's like, yeah, my mom, she had a bucket. We had our uniform on that we took every week, and we went out and we cleaned burials. That was what she did as a child. She remembers it all the way back to when they were holding bodies in the home. And this also requires using maps, aerials, looking at deeds, the typical things that a historian would look at. They're invitations to seek, to remember, to remind us of those sort of things that get lost, the histories that aren't being told. And then it refuses sort of extractive models by really grounding the relationship, the research in those relationships, in that responsibility, in the return, which is why so much of my own insights are embedded in this, because I'm being held accountable too. I'm interacting with this space as a visitor and now really a descendant because of this research. And Christina Sharp again, y'all, as you can clearly tell, but one thing that she does to continue the way, she took a year to just experience life, her usual normal life, and she decided to make something of just ordinary notes, ordinary field notes. And they were really fragmented thoughts that when you kind of look at them collectively, it really kind of captures sort of a really deep, rich sort of narrative that I think is really interesting. And a lot of it is dealing with the consequences of Black life, her relationship with family and so forth, what she observed when she was sitting at the conference. And I think that sort of way of approaching research is really profound to me, especially as someone that's early career CRM professional, who the profession is happening so fast, you're getting these projects in a lot quicker than you would if you just had time to work, aside from your 9 to 5. So I'm like, how do I maximize that I have this constraint in terms of time? Let's create some ordinary notes that are not so ordinary. State work has already been happening. We have an example here with Cemetery Citizens. Totally take a picture of this if you haven't heard of this book, because Adam Rosenblatt is a death worker now. I don't think he ever saw himself as that. I don't even know if I saw myself as that, but it kind of feels kind of cool. It might scare a couple people away, but it's kind of cool. But in this book, he positions these hidden histories and neglected graves as sites of revision. So he was creating a revisionary practice through his approach. He came up with this concept of cemetery citizens. He's like, look, the dead are also citizens. They're here. So what do they need? How do we revise the narratives that are broken, that have been erased? Maybe because there's no longer a marker there. Maybe because, of a natural disaster, and maybe wash some markers away. But how do we revise that? Maybe there were some markers with some errors on it, with misspellings there that might stop someone's journey, their genealogical journey. But he really coins that as a way to refer to volunteers and the dead. Those that were extending their care to the dead and those that were in those grounds, that were denied care in their waking life. And so this ain't really nothing new under the sun. It's just my intervention into how to do this for a Black site and how to do this with other folks who are interested and passionate about these Black sites that are getting overlooked. How do we do that? And so again, neglect, abandonment, disremembering are not accidents. They are heritage conditions. And I always say, these buried Black cemeteries are not dead spaces. They are freedom grounds. They're sovereign. They're where we can find Black cultural life, even though the dead are there. But this is the proof of concept that we were here. And so what constitutes care in Black burial grounds within these geographies of erasure and dispossession? And then how do these descendant-led practices actually improve these Black heritage sites? This was sort of my initial sort of scholarly questions about what is this site, what constitutes this site care within these types of sites that are not perpetual care. And so here's where I kind of pivot. We were able to kind of do a little preliminary documentation of Palmetto Cemetery to receive a state historical marker. Sure, we got, a determination of eligibility. I could go write up a National Register nomination now, but it doesn't actually mean protection. It's just, it's a listing. So do we think about a National Register nomination as we continue that we wrestle with if it's something that we can realistically do? Is it maybe a district? Can we propose a district? You know, there's, Alcor Middle School is happening there. This is like a beneficiary of the school equalization programs, and, we want to separate schools, race even in schools. It just lands right next to the cemetery. It's now predominantly black. So maybe there is a narrative there that also is linked with the cemetery. It's also Northwood Hills. What happened to those parcels of land? Where's the acreage? Where did the reduction come from? There's no trail. I wonder if it had something to do with the development of a white-only neighborhood? Maybe? Traditional cultural property? I mean, there are actions that are happening. There are traditions that are connected to these informal sites. If they're not able to have the benefit of being perpetual care, could it be that these acts continuously happening actually serves as that tradition? I mean, everyone has different cultural practices. This is black people coming to care for their loved ones. Could we argue it that way? So these are all things that we're contemplating. Or maybe we don't need a listing. We could do it ourselves. We've been doing it really since 1920, but 79 is when it was formalized. Oh look, we got a historical marker. So we had our photo moment. There we go. There goes a marker, y'all. Ushering in grant funding through the tax. Nice people from commission. Several folks that came to this event actually said, I think I have family here. That was a win for me, to say the least. Now let's look at the scenes, and I'll breeze through these because I know I've gotten a little long-winded. But I constructed scenes through this endeavor. Again, with that spirit, these are moments, these are like temporal actions. These are my experiences, and I am about all the drama. So I love a good scene. But what were the things that what were the scenes that took place that I think can characterize this practice of staking and just really understanding this site? And these were derived from the language and the work and the conversations that I was having with those that have been caring for the site. And so I divided up the scenes into these sort of thematic focuses. Scene one being holding ground. This is a moment where I captured just some random guy pulled up with a lawnmower and just started cutting grass. And he bagged everything up and he just put it in a section of the cemetery so it wasn't as noticeable because he didn't want people to see the trash. But he cared for so many sites that day. In the heat, y'all, it was so hot this day. Ain't no magic to it. Somebody's gotta care. I heard Mr. Patterson say this to me and I'm asking him what makes him come back to this. And I'm like, this was such a simple thing. Such a simple understanding of a place. It defines, it represents everything that I expected to see. That there were these connections with this site that were deep, maybe they were having these sort of deeper relationship experiences and transforming in the ways that I was. But for the steward, who's 79 years old, who actively digs these, facilitates burials, who actively goes and marks the site whenever, a marker is missing, flags it, so we have some evidence or some record that there is a body there. But it's as simple as just doing it. Sorry, y'all, I wish I had better advice. The work is about being here still. So to hold the grief and the labor, the weeds and the roses, the misspelled names and the ones that we're still trying to remember. Oh, the second scene is called Guarding Rest. And I spent some time with Myrtle Gordon's daughter at her childhood home. This is Vanessa Briggs, who's married to, Titus Briggs, connected to that Briggs versus Elliot Cayce. And she walked me through her neighborhood, and I just wanted to capture some moments in the same spirit that we see Adam Rosenblatt doing when he's sketching moments and sketching interactions and little scrappy forms of care at the cemetery burial. I'm capturing her in moments of just her working moments, her living her life, and I'm hearing and listening to all of her connections to the site. And a lot of what she mentioned, so this is a photo of her, of the core founders of the Palmetto Cemetery Association. This is in an article. And they started this. Myrtle Gordon is centered there. She has 2 keys to the city for her work in developing Black communities and empowering Black communities. So this woman really, was a total boss and a total leader and knew how to build infrastructure and to galvanize and bring groups of people together on a voluntary basis. These are your loved ones. Do it because someone's got to. That care ethic started here with Myrtle Gordon. So I love to bring that up. One of the things I will say about Mrs. Briggs, she was a theater teacher, a drama teacher at Alcorn Middle School, and she, these are middle schoolers. One of the most profound things that she told me was the kids in school were not really eating. They were hungry. They were so hungry because of what their lives looked like when they leave that school that they didn't have time to focus on having an imagination. So that to me is one of those fractures and something that lifted up to me. This could explain why no one knows about Palmetto Cemetery. This could explain why when I wait for the kids to get out of school to see what they do, they walk past the cemetery as if there's like a wall. There's an invisible wall. So there are no gates at the cemetery, you all. There are really no walls or no borders, except for the ones that were created by everyone on the edges. So it just had me thinking about what are the potential relationships and partnerships that still need to happen to tell the fuller story. We don't know what the kids think about this. Could there be a future engagement that involves the young people with an aging demographic of stewards who are no longer going to be able to physically do this work into the next century? That's a huge gap that we had not thought about. Linking the living is scene 3. This is Veronica Britton. She's the current president. She's taken over from Vanessa. And they call and they gossip about each other all the time. They all have a particular way that they like for things to be run. And I love it. I live for it. I love being the recorder for these moments because there's so much to learn from just these informal, just commonplace actions because we care. Linking the living really was about linking the living with the dead. And it came to mind because we actually discovered some of the earlier site maps of the cemetery. And it was created by Eagle Scouts. They mapped out the burial ground. They did site documentation. I'm like, come on over to New South. We could use some support. I mean, seriously. They sectioned it off. They created an inventory. And Vanessa and I, that was one of our interactions. We were like, okay, well, let's go to your family. Let's let's see if we can log some more cemetery sites. This moment here, I love to bring forward. You see here, her grandfather, great-grandfather was William Papa Martin. He's buried there. There you have a whole family burial plot. His headstone is misspelled. So in thinking about revisionary practice and why we return, his name is misspelled. I mean, if I go look up Amelia Martin, I'm not gonna find her grandfather. What an incredible story. But would have been lost if no one thought to go back. If I did not have the descendant to ask to take me there, I wouldn't have known the story behind that marker and how it ended up this way. And no one, her mom her great-grandmother didn't care to fix it. She's like, he's still there. Oh, this cemetery is the cemetery grounds of Zion Chapel Church number 1 in the Crane Creek community. It's like the first Black church in Columbia, really. And my family is buried there. Mrs. Albritton's family is also buried there. And then we had a conversation, and it led to kinship links. So I thought, if we continue to usher these experiences where people are having these informal acts and these conversations with descendants, perhaps we'll find a family member and a link to another site. So it's really starting to build out this sort of atlas of its own, just through the stories, the memories, the connections back to the site. And here were some other moments of that beautiful day, things that we found. There's a shot by my partner, Jared, who's in the audience, y'all. Can't take all the credit. But beautiful moments of the cemetery. We have a mausoleum for Palmer. I mean, you can tell a lot about a site. Look at the difference in scale and the use of material and who's caring for their sites and who's not. We can tell a lot by that too, just from looking at the family names. Well, I guess the Palmers love their loved one, but what's going on with the Davises? Have we checked in with them? And you see here Johnson's burial still going strong. It got overgrown a little bit. We took care of that for the marker. We just thought, out of respect, I think he really asked Straywell to do it. But it's still sitting at the front of the cemetery. There's nothing stopping you from going and seeing it and having a conversation with Johnson. And I won't really repeat too much of this, but I had like a little bit of an interlude just for the sake of making it accessible. An interlude is just this quick time loop, it's like the intro, the connecting thread to get to the next song, it's the transition. And I like to call it between bell and boundary. It's like I talk a lot about the kids and just what I observed with them and what I wish I knew from them and what do they feel about the space. They just cut through, cut around, they don't even really see it. And so I say a cultural disconnection from the burial ground is not caused by a single dramatic event. I'm thinking about temporal connections and how we look at time, but by the slow erosion of everyday ties between generations, clearly between schools and neighborhoods. And so I started to ask this question about, well then, if we want to reconstruct the archive, and where do we find the archive that addresses all the silences, that's in the way, that can tell these fuller stories about these particular types of sites? So is the cemetery an archive? Because we're linking living? There's, is this a kind of way that we can create a collective identity and kind of assign a name to the type of archive that we access when we go to these types of sites? This is where the descendants and the families and the community stewards, they carry what the systems fail to get. Say, when you gonna come back for us? So this is a poem that I wrote. And this was all because of just the conversations that I was having with elders. In the same way that we look at ordinary notes, or we think about these temporal moments, these scenes, and filling in the archives. Part of how I do that is through critical fabulation, which I'll talk about later. But this is my way of critically fabulating to try to fill in the gaps, the narratives, the stories, what they might have felt. What's that embodied knowledge underneath the ground? And it says, say, when you gonna come back for us? We still whisper them songs in unsettled dust, still sitting by weathered stones where names have gone, waiting on somebody to bring us home. The ground remembers even when you don't. Every sigh, every promise, every want. We talk through roots and the whispering trees, sending reminders on the breeze. Y'all got lives now, we get it. And still, we right here where you left us, quiet and real, waiting on voices that bend, not break, on hearts that know what the tending takes. We ain't angry, just tired of being paid dust, y'all. Still dreaming y'all might think of us. Y'all think we gone, but love don't rust. Say, when you gonna come back for us? Here we see a list of interdependent laborers. These laborers really are just kind of surmise, the field encounters, the oral histories, the comfort, the discomforts, the ethical discomforts, archival hauntings. And together they really help to build out that grammar, that orthography. What is stake work? What is the stake? What does it involve? And I come to these sort of 5 labors, but I think this list is going to expand and maybe this will change. But this is really all about witnessing, claiming, linking, guarding, and futuring. How do we keep this thing going in the future? And so we return. I talk about the risk of being buried twice. To be black and buried in this country is to risk being erased twice. Once in death and once again in archives. So if this site goes, the community ages out and no one returns to it. Eventually it will go and we will die again. Again, descendants were already staking. It didn't just begin with my name of it. This is just my intervention. They were practices of care, cleanup, burial knowledge, record keeping, seasonal returns, family-based governance, just an overall refusal to just not let it disappear. And fragments are not an excuse to stop. Just because there are fragments there don't mean you give up. And this is where the critical fabulation, the Saidiya Hartman sort of influence comes in. You know, she uses critical fabulation to really fill in the gaps and address the historical silences and the violence that exists in records that concern Black people and tellings of Black history and culture. And she fills it up with stories that are, yes, fictional, but they capture the experience and they really sort of give us an understanding of what was felt. What does that feel like for you? So when you're reading a history connected to the site, you're not looking at this superficially. You're dealing with it ethically. You're sitting with it. And so this is my disciplined way of just sort of staying with the lives of people that, you know, get typically disregarded. And that's where that poem, Say When You Gonna Come For Us, very Zora Neale Hurston, if I must say so. I also wrote one When We Get Home. I won't read this one to y'all for the sake of time. But it's just another example. It's a charge. It's about futurity. When we return, this is what we gonna do when we see each other again. And it makes me return back to this initial slide. I go to prepare a place for you. These were her last words. Her last words were thinking about her own culture and if we would even exist. It was never about if, actually. She declares it. I'm going to prepare that place for you. It doesn't end. That's cemetery citizenship. I'm like, the dead is speaking to us. She spoke to us right as she's exiting her carnal life. So we are not only waking, we are staking. We are preparing for the dead, for the living, for the ones who are still trying to find their way back, for the histories that were never meant to survive, for the futures that require us to keep the ground open. Thank you.
And I'm sure you will be